The day my father and brother stole my company, I was lying in a hospital bed fighting to keep my unborn child alive. They walked in with a stack of legal papers, a severance check that wouldn't even cover my medical bills, and a smile that said they thought I was too weak to fight back. What they didn't know was that I had already signed one document that could destroy everything they had just stolen. I was 32 weeks pregnant. The fetal monitors next to my bed were tracking a dangerously erratic heart rate, and the IV in my left arm was pumping medication to keep my blood pressure from spiking into a stroke. I was exhausted, terrified for my unborn child, and completely physically trapped. My father, Richard, and my younger brother, Marcus, did not bring flowers when they visited me in the high-risk maternity ward. They brought a heavy manila envelope. Marcus complained about the cost of the hospital parking garage before he even bothered to ask if I was okay. Richard stood at the foot of my bed, refusing to look at the medical monitors, his arms crossed defensively over his expensive golf polo. "The supply chain doesn't pause for maternity leave, Nora," Richard said, his voice flat and completely devoid of paternal warmth. "You are going to be tied up with a premature baby in the NICU for months. The company needs active, uncompromised leadership right now. Marcus is stepping up as president. It is what is best for the brand." "The brand?" I asked, my voice dry and raspy. I had created the brand. For 10 years, I had been the absolute engine of Sterling Freight. I worked 14-hour days, missing holidays and weekends, building our client roster from scratch. When a massive shipment was delayed at the port at 3 a.m., my phone rang. When Marcus wrecked a client presentation with his incompetence, I was the one who flew to Dallas to salvage the account. Richard took the title of CEO because he liked the sound of it at his country club, but everyone in the industry knew who actually ran the floor. Marcus slid the manila envelope onto my rolling tray table. "We voted this morning, Nora. Dad has 51% of the voting shares. I have 20. We executed the emergency absentee buyout clause." I looked at the envelope, then slowly reached out with my unhooked arm to open it. Inside was a legal notice of termination and a certified cashier's check. $50,000. I was staring at a severance check for a company that had cleared $12 million in gross revenue the previous year, revenue I had personally generated. "This barely covers my medical deductible and the impending NICU costs," I stated, looking directly at my father. "You should have thought about financial stability before deciding to have a child on your own," Richard replied smoothly. "Logistics is a relentless man's game. You need to focus on being a mother now. Take the check, leave the business to us." They thought this hospital bed was my finish line. They looked at a woman tethered to an IV pole and assumed she was a woman who could no longer fight. They were banking on my absolute vulnerability, assuming the panic of a high-risk pregnancy would force me into quiet submission. In their arrogant rush to cut me loose and save money, they completely voided my employment contract, meaning they didn't even bother to bind me to a non-compete clause. They truly believed a single mother with a premature baby wouldn't have the energy to fight back. I looked at Marcus. He was adjusting the cuffs of a tailored suit paid for by my logistical strategies. I looked at Richard, who was already checking his phone, thoroughly bored by his own daughter's medical crisis. I didn't cry. Tears are a currency you only spend on people who value your pain. These men didn't. I picked up a pen from the tray, signed the acknowledgement of receipt with a perfectly steady hand, and slid the legal paper back into the envelope. "Leave the check," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, icy register, "and leave." Marcus smirked, clearly thinking he had won an effortless victory. "Get some rest, sis." When the door clicked shut behind them, the room went completely silent except for the rhythmic, pulsing beep of the fetal monitor. I picked up the check. $50,000. To anyone else, it was an insult, but to a woman who knew exactly how to build an empire from a single folding table, $50,000 wasn't a severance. It was seed money. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and pulled up my personal contact list. Richard and Marcus could steal my legal shares, but they couldn't steal my relationships. They couldn't steal my brain. I dialed the number of Sterling Freight's largest, most lucrative client. "Nora?" the client answered, sounding surprised. "I thought you were on emergency medical leave." "I am," I said, watching the IV drip fluid into my vein. "But my medical leave just became a permanent resignation. I'm starting my own firm, and I am calling to ask exactly when your current contract with Sterling expires." My son, Evan, was delivered via emergency C-section 3 days after that boardroom coup. He weighed barely 3 pounds, a tiny, fragile fighter hooked up to a terrifying array of tubes and monitors in the neonatal intensive care unit. Leaving the hospital without him was a physical kind of agony. Walking out of those sliding glass doors with an empty car seat was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. But grief is a luxury, and I didn't have time for it. I went back to my 2-bedroom apartment, deposited the $50,000 severance check, and went to a discount office supply store. I bought a cheap plastic folding table, the exact same kind I had used 10 years ago in my father's garage, 2 high-definition monitors, and a business phone. By midnight, I had registered the LLC for Meridian Logistics. By dawn, I had secured a commercial freight broker license. For the next 3 months, my life existed in 2 extreme, contrasting realities. During the day, I sat beside Evan's plastic incubator. I couldn't hold him often, so I rested my hand through the porthole, letting his tiny fingers wrap around my thumb. I didn't sing lullabies. Instead, I whispered supply chain strategies, shipping manifests, and customs regulations to him. I told him how we were going to build an empire that nobody could ever steal from us. At night, sitting at that folding table in my kitchen, I waged a quiet, relentless corporate war. The logistics industry is built on trust, precision, and the ability to solve catastrophic problems at 3 in the morning. Richard and Marcus had none of those qualities. They relied entirely on the infrastructure I had built. But infrastructure requires maintenance, and Arrogance is a terrible mechanic. The first crack in Sterling Freight's armor appeared exactly 6 weeks after I was forced out. My prepaid business phone rang at 2 a.m. It was David, the regional director of a massive industrial parts manufacturer and Sterling's second-largest account. "Nora," David said, sounding frantic, "I know you're on medical leave, but I am desperate. 4 of our cargo trucks are held up at the border because the customs clearance wasn't filed properly. I have been calling Marcus for 3 hours, and his phone goes straight to voicemail." I pulled up my laptop and opened a blank manifest. "Marcus turns his phone off at midnight, David. He values his sleep. This delay is going to cost my company hundreds of thousands of dollars in assembly line downtime. Can you call the border agents? You know them." "I can't clear Sterling's freight," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I no longer work for Sterling. My father and brother executed an absentee buyout while I was in the high-risk maternity ward." Dead silence on the line. David was a ruthless businessman, but he was also a father of 3. "They did what?" "However," I continued, seamlessly shifting gears, "I just opened Meridian Logistics. I have no non-compete clause holding me back. If you officially terminate your contract with Sterling for breach of service and sign a digital retainer with Meridian right now, I can legally broker those trucks across the border within 45 minutes. David didn't even hesitate. "Send the contract." I sent the PDF, watched his digital signature populate on my screen, and made 2 phone calls to customs officials who had known and respected me for a decade. 38 minutes later, the trucks were moving. When Marcus woke up the next morning, he didn't just have an angry client. He had a canceled contract and a massive hole in his quarterly revenue. That was the first domino. It was not the last. Over the next 12 months, I didn't have to actively destroy my father and brother. I just had to stand there with a safety net while they destroyed themselves. Marcus alienated our most reliable independent truck drivers by cutting their per-mile rates to pad his own executive bonus. I immediately hired them at a premium. Richard refused to upgrade the routing software, causing massive scheduling errors. I scooped up the furious clients who defected. I worked with a baby strapped to my chest in a carrier, pacing the living room, negotiating multi-million-dollar freight contracts while warming up bottles of formula. Every time exhaustion threatened to break me, I looked at Evan, who was growing stronger and healthier every single day, and I remembered my father standing by my hospital bed, telling me to focus on being a mother instead of a burden. I was doing exactly what he asked. I was being a mother who was systematically absorbing their entire market share. By the 18-month mark, Meridian Logistics had outgrown my apartment. I leased a sleek, modern commercial office space in a downtown high-rise. I had 12 employees, a massive digital dispatch center, and a revenue stream that tripled what I had ever made at Sterling. I hadn't spoken to Richard or Marcus since the hospital. I didn't look at their social media. I didn't ask industry contacts about them. But in the logistics world, failure has a very loud echo. I knew Sterling Freight was drowning. I just didn't know how fast the water was rising until the receptionist buzzed my office phone on a Tuesday afternoon. "Nora," she said, her voice a bit uncertain, "there are 2 men here to see you. They don't have an appointment, but they say they are your father and brother." I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Send them in, please." The heavy glass door of my office swung open. Richard and Marcus walked in. The contrast was almost jarring. My office was a testament to modern success. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Dallas skyline, minimalist furniture, and a massive analytics board tracking millions of dollars in active freight. They looked like ghosts. Marcus was wearing a suit that seemed half a size too big, the arrogant swagger completely drained from his posture. Richard looked 10 years older. The country club tan had faded, replaced by deep gray stress lines around his eyes. They stood awkwardly in front of my desk. I didn't stand up. I didn't offer them a seat. "Nora," Richard started, clearing his throat. He tried to muster that old, authoritative CEO voice, but it cracked. "The new office is impressive." "It's efficient," I corrected, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I have a board meeting in 10 minutes. What do you want, Richard?" Using his first name made him flinch. Marcus stepped forward, dropping a thick, disorganized folder onto my desk. It looked remarkably like the manila envelope they had handed me in the maternity ward. "Sterling is going under," Marcus blurted out, the panic cracking through his facade. "We lost the industrial parts contract first, then the grocery distributors pulled out. The bank is calling in the commercial loans. We are going to lose the warehouse, the trucks, everything." I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "That sounds like a severe operational failure. What does that have to do with Meridian Logistics?" Richard placed both hands on my desk, leaning in with a desperate, pleading look. "We need a buyout, Nora. We need Meridian to acquire Sterling Freight. If you absorb our remaining assets and cover the outstanding bank loans, it keeps the business in the family. We can merge. Marcus and I can come on as senior consultants." I stared at him. The sheer, blinding audacity of it was almost poetic. They had stripped me of my life's work for $50,000 when I was strapped to a fetal monitor fighting for my son's life, and now they wanted me to bail out their catastrophic failure and give them executive salaries. I finally reached out and opened the folder. I didn't read the pathetic financial projections. I just looked at the massive red numbers at the bottom of the ledger. They were drowning in millions of dollars of debt. I closed the folder and slid it back across the desk until it bumped against Marcus's hands. "I'm not buying Sterling Freight," I said, my voice quiet and absolute. "Nora, please," Richard pleaded, his voice breaking. "You're my daughter. We are family. If you don't do this, the bank will take my house. Marcus will have to file for personal bankruptcy. You can't just turn your back on your own blood." I leaned back in my leather chair, folding my hands together. "The supply chain doesn't pause for family emergencies, Richard." He froze. He recognized the words immediately. "Meridian Logistics needs active, uncompromised leadership right now," I continued, echoing the exact speech he had given me 18 months ago. "Your company is drowning in debt due to gross incompetence. Buying your worthless assets wouldn't be a business strategy. It would be a bailout. And logistics is a relentless man's game, isn't it?" Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. You're really going to let us lose everything?" "I didn't lose anything for you," I replied. "You lost it yourselves. You thought leadership was a title. You thought you could steal the engine and still expect the car to run. I am simply letting the market correct your mistakes." "Nora," Richard started. "Take the folder," I said, cutting him off with the exact icy tone I had used in the hospital room. "And leave." For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence in the office was absolute. Then, Marcus slowly picked up the folder. He didn't say another word. He turned and walked out the glass door. Richard lingered for a second, looking at me like he was searching for the daughter who used to work 14-hour shifts just to make him proud. He didn't find her. He turned and followed his son. When the door clicked shut, I didn't feel a sudden rush of dramatic vindication. I just felt light. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. On my desk, a silver picture frame held a photo of Evan. He was no longer a fragile 3-pound baby in a plastic incubator. He was a thriving, loud, fiercely independent toddler with a bright, unstoppable smile. People who demand your loyalty without offering their respect will always call your boundaries a betrayal. They will tell you that family means unconditional sacrifice, regardless of how deeply they cut you. But true strength isn't about enduring abuse quietly. It's about knowing exactly what you are worth, taking the raw materials of your worst moments and building an empire they can never touch. I didn't just survive their betrayal, I outgrew it. And in the world of business, just like in life, there is no sweeter justice than undeniable success.